The bus was still running when the police arrived. Inside, 3 fighters sat with their backs against the seats, stunned, silent, one of them nursing a wrist that bent the wrong direction. The man who'd done it? He was already back behind the wheel, engine idling, hands folded in his lap, waiting calmly for dispatch to respond. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a bus driver. And that was the problem. That was always the problem. But he saw him coming. Not until it was far, far too late. If this kind of story moves you, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who never announce what they're capable of, hit subscribe right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay until the very end, because what happens in the final part of this story will change the way you see strength forever. The snow came early to Blackridge that year. By the 3rd week of November, the mountains surrounding the town had already buried their lower slopes under 2 feet of pack. Roads, the narrow, switchback roads that climbed from the valley floor up toward the resort corridors, were the kind of roads that reminded you how small you were, how far from help, how quickly a wrong turn became a last turn. Most people who didn't grow up in Blackridge hated those roads. The drivers who ran them every day barely thought about them anymore. Caleb Vance was one of those drivers. Yes, he'd intervened. He'd been running Route 70's the mountain loop that connected the transit hub in Lower Blackridge to the cluster of ski resorts, employee dormitories, overlook lodges that sat at the 7,200-foot elevation line. The route took 43 minutes one way in good conditions. In weather like tonight's, you doubled it and added a prayer. The bus groaned against headwinds that came off the peaks like something with a grudge. The wipers worked in a frantic, metronomic rhythm that never quite cleared the glass before the next wave of snow hit. Caleb didn't mind. He drove with both hands on the wheel, and his eyes moving rode the way a man drives when he's been trained to track multiple sectors at once and never fully lost the habit. His uniform was clean but worn at the elbows. His work boots were resoled. There was a small laminated photo taped to the edge of his dashboard. Just inside his peripheral vision, a girl, 12 years old, gap in her front teeth, holding up a fish she'd caught the previous summer, like it was a trophy at the Olympics. His daughter. His whole reason the route existed. Caleb had a slight limp left leg, product of a thing that had happened in a place he didn't talk about, and it was noticeable when he walked but irrelevant when he drove. Passengers who rode Route 17 regularly knew him by his voice on the PA, and by the way he always had the heat up, 2 degrees higher than regulation, because the resort workers who rode his bus in the early morning were always underdressed and half asleep. Small mercy, the kind nobody asked about. He was 42 years old. He looked older in certain lights. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, not rude, not cold, just economical. A face that had learned long ago that expressions cost something, and he'd learned to budget carefully. The 9:40 p.m. run was the last full loop of the night. Picked up stragglers, late shift resort employees heading home, the occasional tourist who'd missed the earlier shuttles, sometimes a handful of night skiers who'd pushed closing time and smelled like vin glug and cold air. 17 passengers tonight. Caleb had counted them the way he always counted, not obsessively, just automatically, the way you learn to account for everyone in a confined space when your life once depended on knowing exactly how many bodies were in a room. The trouble got on at the Mountain View transit stop at 9:47 p.m. 4 of them. Caleb noticed them before they reached the door. Hard not to. 3 were built the way young men get built when they've spent serious time in a gym and want the world to know about it. Broad through the shoulders, narrow through the patience. The 4th was different. He was the one in front. 25, maybe. 6'1", athletic without being bulky, the kind of build that moved well rather than just looked impressive. He wore a fitted black jacket with the collar turned up against the snow, and he walked with the particular confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional for long enough that he'd started to believe it in his bones. Performed confidence that was easier to spot and easier to dismiss. This was the settled kind. The kind that comes from winning. Caleb had met men like that before, in different contexts. Under very different circumstances, he watched them climb the steps. The one in front, he'd learned the name later. Ryder Kane scanned the bus interior, the way a predator scans a room. Consciously, just as reflex, categorizing, assessing, filing. His eyes touched Caleb for roughly half a second, moved on, and never came back, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about how Ryder Kane saw the world. Some people are worth your attention. Some are furniture. Cards or cash, Caleb said as they passed the reader. Ryder's teammate tapped a card. The other two followed. Ryder himself paused, looked at Caleb with the kind of mild amusement you give a parking meter. You got Wi-Fi on this thing? No. Figures. He tapped his card and moved past without another word. Caleb's eyes went back to the road. They settled toward the rear of the bus, the back 5 rows, which were mostly empty at that hour. The 4 of them spread out, the way young men do when they want space and want other people to know they're taking it. Volume immediately went up. Not shouting, not yet, just the particular loudness of men who've decided the space belongs to them. The other passengers shifted. Subtle adjustment, shoulders angling away, earphones going in, gazes dropping to phones. The silent, universal recalibration of people sharing a space with something they've identified as trouble and decided to navigate around rather than confront. Caleb watched it in the rearview mirror. He'd seen the same adjustment in different theaters. Refugees making themselves smaller on a truck bed. Villagers at a marketplace when a patrol walked through. Hostages rearranging themselves against a wall. The geometry of people trying to become invisible. He drove. For the first 20 minutes, it stayed manageable. Obnoxious. The kind of thing you could technically file a complaint about, but not much more. Ryder's crew was talking about a fight card coming up in Missoula, a regional MMA showcase, where Ryder was apparently headlining, and the conversation had the self-congratulatory flavor of men performing. For each other's benefit, as much as for their own. Marchetti's got nothing for me, Ryder said, loud enough that the front half of the bus could hear it clearly. Guy gasses in the second. I've seen his cardio on tape. He gasses, and then he made a sound. A short, blunt sound that implied something decisive happening to someone's structural integrity. His friends laughed. You worried at all? One of them asked. Marchetti? A pause. Then lighter, maybe about the drive up. Guy behind the wheel looks like he might have a heart attack before we get there. More laughter. Caleb's jaw moved slightly. That was the only visible response. He adjusted the defroster, checked his side mirrors, and kept driving. The incident with the woman began at the 9:58 mark, 21 minutes into the run, somewhere on the ascending switchback between mile marker 14 and 15, where the road bent hard left and the mountain dropped away on the passenger side into a gorge you couldn't see the bottom of in daylight, let alone at night. Her name, Caleb would later learn, was Jessie Harmon, 23. She worked housekeeping at the Ridgeline Lodge and was 6 months into her first season in Blackridge, having moved up from Billings for the work. Yes, she was small, 5'2" maybe, and she sat alone in the third row from the back with her earbuds in, and her head tilted slightly against the window, watching the dark come down through the glass. She had been invisible, until Ryder decided she wasn't. He'd moved forward gradually the way these things always happen, gradually drifting one row, then another, under the cover of the group's noise and the general blur of the bus ride. His teammate Marcus had taken the seat directly behind her 10 minutes ago. Neither of them had spoken to her yet. Then Ryder slid into the seat beside her. He reached across and pulled her right earbud out of her ear. It wasn't violent. It was casual. The casualness was the point. The way you handle something that belongs to you, without permission, without hesitation. Her face changed. Oh, she started. Where you headed? Ryder asked. She looked at him the way a person looks at a thing they're trying to calculate. Is this dangerous or just uncomfortable? How much space is there between me and the aisle? Ridgeline, she said. Yeah, I'm up at the peak. You been there? He leaned slightly into her space. Aggressive. Just present. Inescapably present. You should come up sometime. He smiled. It was probably a smile that worked often. I can get you on the comp list. I'm okay, thanks. What's your name? She hesitated. I'd rather just... I'm Ryder. He extended his hand, not as an offer, as an expectation. She didn't take it. Something shifted in him then. Caleb caught it in the mirror, a microchange. The kind that happens when a man accustomed to a certain response gets a different one. Rage, not yet. Just the recalibration of someone deciding what category of effort this situation requires. Marcus leaned forward from the seat behind her. He's on the card in Missoula. Next weekend, he offered. Like it was helpful information. Like it explained something. Jesse turned back toward the window. Ryder stayed where he was. The bus climbed. Snow hammered the windows. The engine worked hard on the grade, a low industrial groan that you felt in your back teeth. Caleb held the wheel at 10 and 2 and ran his eyes between the road and the mirror in a rotation that had become so ingrained it didn't require conscious thought. He saw Ryder lean closer to Jesse. He heard over the bus noise Ryder say something he couldn't fully catch, but he caught enough. Tone, the proximity. And he saw Jesse's shoulders go rigid in the way that a woman's shoulders go rigid when she has decided that moving will make things worse. 3 passengers in the forward rows had seen it. All 3 were staring at their laps. Buddy moved. Caleb exhaled through his nose. There was a turnout at mile marker 16, a gravel pull-off, used by maintenance vehicles and plow trucks. He'd used it a handful of times over 6 years for various reasons. Weather checks. A passenger with motion sickness. One time, a coyote that had gotten onto the road and sat there, staring at his headlights for 4 full minutes before deciding it had somewhere better to be. He turned into it now. The gravel crunched under the tires. The bus swayed slightly as it left the pavement. The engine settled to a lower register as he brought the vehicle to a stop, set the brake, and killed the forward momentum with the calm precision of a man who has done it 10,000 times. Every passenger felt the bus stop. Conversations dropped. Heads came up. Ryder looked toward the front of the bus with mild irritation. Caleb picked up the PA handset. His voice came through the cabin speakers, not loud, not theatrical, just present and clear in the way a voice is when it knows it has exactly one thing to say. Back of the bus. Leave the young woman alone and return to your seat. Silence. For a moment. Just a moment. Something flickered across Ryder Kane's face that might have been surprise. Then it was gone, replaced by something Caleb had seen the shape of before. Amusement laced with contempt. The look of a man deciding how to perform for an audience. Stood up slowly from the seat beside Jesse. You talking to me, driver? Caleb set the handset back in its cradle. He said nothing. Ryder started walking forward. He had the kind of walk that was designed to be watched shoulders loose, arms slightly out. The deliberate pace of someone who wanted everyone on the bus to understand that this was not a response driven by urgency or concern. This was a performance. He was strolling. He was showing the 17 passengers on Route 17 that a limping, middle-aged, government-wage bus driver had made a very interesting decision in calling him out. His teammates had shifted forward in their seats, watching. A few passengers shrank back. Ryder stopped about 4 feet from the driver's partition, close enough to dominate the space, far enough to leave himself room to move. You got a problem? He asked. Caleb looked at him through the partition glass. I asked her to be left alone, Caleb said. She looked like she agreed with that. She's fine. We're just talking. She didn't look like she was enjoying the conversation. Ryder tilted his head, a small, slow smile. You know who I am? I know you're a passenger on my bus, Caleb said. Now that's the only relevant fact. The smile stretched wider. Ryder glanced back at his friends, performing, still performing, always performing. Man, he said, turning back. You are something else. You know that? He looked Caleb over the worn uniform, the age in his face, the leg that had given out slightly when Caleb had shifted his weight to the left a moment ago. Ryder's eyes cataloged all of it. How long you been driving a bus, man? Long enough. Yeah. You like it? I do. Ryder leaned one hand against the partition edge, like he was having a chat at a bar. Must be tough, he said. Getting this old and still grinding for city pay. That's rough. He shook his head with the kind of theatrical sympathy that means its opposite. I got guys who ride this route, man. They told me about you. Said you always got the heat going. Always real polite. He let a pause settle. Didn't tell me you had a mouth on you, though. Caleb said nothing. Here's what's going to happen, Ryder continued. You're going to open that door, get back on the road, and mind your business. How's that sound? Caleb's hands rested on his knees. Sir, he said, I've asked you once. Go back to your seat. This conversation is done. And if I don't, then we wait here until Blackridge Dispatch sends a supervisor and you file a complaint through the Transit Authority office. A beat. Either way, the young lady stays where she is and you don't go near her again. Ryder straightened up. The smile was still there, but it was different now. Performative layer had thinned. Underneath it was something flatter and less patient. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. You're serious, he said. Like it was a diagnosis. I'm very serious. All right, Ryder rolled his neck. A slow, deliberate rotation. All right, driver. He took one step back, and for a half second, Caleb thought the situation was going to deflate on its own, that Ryder was calculating and finding the math unfavorable, and retreating back to his seat with whatever dignity he could carry. Marcus called out from the rear. Ryder, man, just... I got it, Ryder said. Short, flat, the voice of a man who'd decided. He turned back to Caleb. Last chance, he said quietly. Walk it back. Say you were just doing your job. We all move on. Go sit down. Something happened behind Ryder's eyes. Performance stopped. He was no longer performing for his teammates, or for the passengers, or for himself. He was just moving, and he moved fast. A sudden pivot toward the partition gate, with his right hand coming up. The motion of a trained fighter, who had made a decision and was executing it with the economical efficiency of someone who had ended a lot of problems exactly this way. Caleb was already out of his seat. He'd been rising for the last 4 seconds. But he on the bus had noticed it, because Caleb had learned in rooms and corridors and compounds that no longer existed on any map that the most important movement is the one your opponent hasn't clocked yet. Ryder's fist came through the gate opening, and Caleb was no longer where it was going. He was 6 inches to the left, and his left hand was already moving. What happened next took approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds that nobody on that bus would forget for the rest of their lives. Ryder Kane hit the front handrail. Violently, not the way you see in movies where someone gets hurled through space in a cinematic arc. He hit it the way something hits when the force directing it has been precisely redirected, not amplified. Controlled consequence. He went down on one knee, caught himself, blinked. His expression, in the first half second, was pure confusion. Genuine, unfiltered confusion. Because nothing in his experience, not the sparring sessions, not the amateur bouts, not the regional cards where he'd built his reputation, had prepared him for the reality of what it felt like when someone moved that way. Telegraphing, no wind-up, no hesitation. Just a shift, a redirect. And suddenly the world was at a 45-degree angle and his knee was on a rubber mat. Up at Caleb. Caleb was standing 2 feet away, balanced, hands loose at his sides, watching him with an expression that wasn't angry or triumphant or afraid. It was patient. That was the part that hit hardest. From the back, Marcus was already moving. He'd stood up the second Ryder went down, all 230 pounds of him, pushing between the seats. He was not a precise sight fighter, but he was large. And he was committed, and he moved with the momentum of a man who expected that to be enough. It wasn't enough. Caleb moved again. 1 step offline, 1 hand on the arm, a shift of weight that used Marcus's own forward motion as the engine of his problem. Marcus hit the support pole midway down the aisle, wrapped around it briefly, and slid to the floor in a way that looked more confused than hurt. He sat there blinking. The bus was absolutely silent. 17 passengers. Not one of them made a sound. The only thing audible was the wind against the windows and the idle of the engine, and, somewhere in the rear, the barely audible ambient noise of a phone still playing music through abandoned earbuds. Ryder's other 2 teammates had stood up. They were looking at Caleb. Caleb looked back at them. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. There are moments in a room when the air itself changes composition, when something invisible recalibrates every person present's understanding of where the actual threat in the space is located. This was one of those moments. The 2 men sat back down. Caleb turned to the PA handset. Blackridge Transit Dispatch. This is Route 17, Vehicle 44. Requesting police assist at mile marker 16 turnout. Emergency situation is contained. Passengers are safe. He set the handset down. picked up his radio, repeated the call on the secondary channel with his operator ID and the incident code. He did it all in the same tone he used to announce upcoming stops. He sat back down. He put his hands on his knees, and he waited. Through the windshield, the snow came down without opinion. The mountain did what mountains do it, waited, enormous and indifferent, while the small human drama, the small metal box at its feet, resolved itself into silence. Ryder Kane picked himself up off the floor of the bus. He didn't say anything. He looked at his hands, at his knee, at Marcus, who was still sitting in the aisle looking at the ceiling. Caleb's back, visible through the partition, a worn collar transit uniform, a man sitting quietly behind a wheel. In 23 years of his life, Ryder had never once been put on his knee by someone he had already categorized as harmless. He didn't know yet what to do with that. So he went back to his seat, and he sat there in the dark and the noise of the storm and stared out the window at nothing, while the blue and red lights started to show through the snow, still miles away, but approaching, painting the inside of the bus in slow, cold pulses. Jessie Harmon, 3 rows back, had her arms wrapped around herself, and her eyes closed, and she was breathing with the controlled deliberateness of someone working very hard to hold themselves together. So, yes, she'd saying. In the seat across the aisle from her, an older man, a resort maintenance worker, named Harold, who'd been riding Route 17 for 3 years, leaned slightly toward her. "You're okay," Harold said quietly. It wasn't a question. She nodded. At the front of the bus, Caleb sat behind the wheel and looked at the small laminated photo on his dashboard. Gap-toothed, holding a fish like a trophy. He let out a slow breath. Just a bus driver. That's all he was. That's all he'd ever tried to be. The lights were getting closer, and in the rear of the bus, Ryder Kane was still staring at his own hands, trying to understand how a limping 42-year-old city employee had moved like that, had looked like that, had stood there afterward, with that particular stillness that Ryder recognized now that he was about it clearly from somewhere he couldn't quite name. He would name it later. He would understand it later. Not yet. Right now, the police lights were sliding through the snow. The bus was idling in the dark, and a man whose name Ryder didn't even know yet was sitting 30 feet away from him, waiting in the patient, unhurried way of someone who has spent a long time learning that most things worth waiting for eventually arrive on their own. The first cruiser pulled into the turnout at 10:24 p.m. The second was 40 seconds behind it. Ryder watched the doors open, watched the officers step out into the weather, with their flashlights cutting white cones through the falling snow. He understood, sitting there, in the back of a mountain bus in the middle of a blizzard with his knee still aching, and Marcus still not entirely sure what had happened to him, he understood that something had changed. He just didn't know yet how much. He didn't know yet that the video was already recording. The first officer through the bus door was young, mid-20s, maybe, with snow on his shoulders, and the careful professional neutrality of someone who had been trained to read a room before deciding what kind of room it was. He read this one in about 4 seconds. 17 passengers. Varying degrees of tension. 2 men in the rear aisle area who looked like they'd recently had an argument with a stationary object and lost. A woman near the back with her arms wrapped around herself. The front, behind the wheel, a transit driver sitting in the exact posture of a man who had done something, finished doing it, and was now simply waiting for the administrative portion of the evening to begin. The officer addressed Caleb first. "You called it in?" Operator ID 4417. Caleb Vance, Route 17. He reached into the door pocket and produced his transit ID card without being asked. The incident involved a passenger harassing a young woman, followed by a physical assault directed at me. Responded, "The situation is contained. No injuries requiring medical." He paused. "The young woman in row 7 may want someone to speak with her. She's had a rough 20 minutes. The officer took the ID card, looked at it, looked at Caleb. Something moved behind his eyes, a small recalibration. The kind that happens when the facts of a situation don't quite match the picture you assembled walking in. And the men in the rear? Passengers. The one in the black jacket initiated contact. The larger one followed. A second officer had boarded by then and was already moving down the aisle, hand on his belt, eyes moving over the seated passengers with the efficiency of someone doing a fast threat inventory. He reached Ryder and Marcus and stopped. "Everybody stay seated," he said. Loud, just final. Ryder was already sitting. He had both hands on his knees and his jaw set in the particular way of a man swallowing something he hasn't decided how to spit back out yet. Marcus sat beside him, still working through the geometry of how he'd ended up on the floor, rotating his shoulder in small circles, the way you do when you're checking if something still works. The first officer stepped back toward Caleb. He lowered his voice slightly, not quite private but quieter than the space required. "You want to tell me what happened? Simple version or the version that matches the camera?" The officer blinked. "There's a camera? Forward-facing and cabin. Transit Authority installed them 2 years ago." Caleb gestured toward the small housing above the windshield without looking at it. "It records to a rolling 36-hour buffer. Dispatch can pull the footage remotely." "A beat." "Okay," the officer said. "Give me both versions." Took 22 minutes to get everyone's account. Officers worked methodically splitting passengers, taking statements, working the rear of the bus, while snow continued to pile up against the windows and the engine idled, and the overhead lights gave everything a pale, institutional glow that made the whole scene feel slightly unreal, like a photograph of something, rather than the thing itself. Ryder gave his statement standing up, which the officer allowed, positioned near the rear exit door with his arms crossed. He was composed. Caleb would give him that. Whatever he felt, and Caleb could read enough from across the bus to know that what Ryder felt was a complex and uncomfortable mixture of humiliation and anger, and something that hadn't settled into it. Yet he kept it behind a practiced exterior. Told the officer that the driver had escalated a minor situation unnecessarily, that he'd been talking to a passenger, that when he'd approached to discuss the driver's attitude, the driver had attacked him without warning. He said it with the smooth confidence of someone who'd spent enough time around sports media to know how to deliver a narrative. The officer wrote it down. Then the officer spoke to Jessie. Jessie Harmon sat in the same seat she'd been in all night, knees pressed together, hands in her lap. She was small in the way that had made her an easy target, and she answered the officer's questions in the careful, exhausted voice of someone who had already calculated the cost of speaking honestly and decided it was worth it. She described exactly what had happened: the earbud, the leaning, the hand that didn't move from the seat back, the feel of 200 pounds of presence using proximity the way a wall uses proximity not touching. Just there, this inescapable, reducing the available space until what was left wasn't really space at all. The officer wrote all of it down. Harold, the maintenance worker, corroborated her account without embellishment. 2 other passengers from the midsection of the bus did the same. Teenager near the middle, maybe 16. Earbuds around his neck, the kind of kid who was on his phone constantly but missed nothing, told the officer he'd recorded part of it on his phone before things happened quickly. "Can send it," the kid said. "I already sent it to my friend." The officer looked at him. "How many people has your friend sent it to?" Kid checked his phone and made a face that answered the question. Caleb was the last one they spoke to at length. By then, most passengers had been cleared to sit or had given their statements and retreated back into the particular exhausted quiet of people who had witnessed something and were still digesting it. The second officer had taken Ryder and Marcus to the rear of the bus for a more formal accounting. The other 2 from Ryder's group, a lean, quiet one who'd said almost nothing all night, and a stockier one who'd laughed the most during the early part of the run, were seated separately and looking like men who were very carefully reconsidering their associations. The first officer, his nameplate, said Deluc, sat in the seat directly behind the driver's partition and opened his notepad. "Walk me through it from the start," he said. "Your version." Caleb did. He was precise, overly detailed, but specific where specificity mattered: times, positions, the exact words where he remembered them, approximate words where he didn't. He described the escalation in the linear, dispassionate way of someone trained to file incident reports rather than tell stories. He noted that he had pulled over before engaging verbally, that he had issued a verbal warning twice before the physical confrontation, and that he had used minimum necessary force to stop what he had assessed as an active physical threat. Necessary force. DeLuca had been writing. He stopped when Caleb said that. Necessary force, DeLuca repeated. He looked up. That's phrasing I hear from. He stopped himself. Adjusted. That specific language. Caleb waited. Are you law enforcement? Prior military? A pause. Short but present. Prior, Caleb said a while ago. DeLuca wrote something. Looked at it. Looked back up. What branch? Navy. Combat? Caleb looked at him with the same patient, economical expression he'd held all night. I drove a bus for 6 years, he said. Tonight, I stopped a passenger from harassing a young woman and defended myself when he became physical. That's the relevant history. DeLuca held his gaze for a moment, then wrote something else and closed the notepad. He leaned back slightly. For what it's worth, DeLuca said, quite officially, the accounts line up. Woman's statement, the maintenance guy, the video, the kid shot. You pulled over, you warned him twice. He went for you. He paused. You've got nothing to worry about on our end. I'm not worried, Caleb said. I want to make sure she's okay. DeLuca glanced toward the rear of the bus. She will be. Another pause. She's going to have to give a formal statement downtown. You too, probably, within the next couple days. Transit Authority will want their own report. I'll be there. DeLuca nodded and stood up. He looked at Caleb for one more moment, the worn uniform, the stillness, the calm shifted even slightly over the last hour, and then he went back down the aisle to complete the rest of his work. They took Ryder and Marcus off the bus at 11:08 p.m. Ryder walked down the aisle with his jaw forward, and his eyes on nothing in particular, doing the thing that people do when they're being watched and they know it, and they've decided that the only available form of dignity is refusing to give the watchers what they expect. He didn't look at Caleb as he passed, didn't look at Jesse, didn't look at Harold or DeLuca or the teenager who was still on his phone. He looked in that moment like someone walking through a place he'd already decided he wasn't in. Marcus followed him. His shoulder was still bothering him. He held it slightly angled, the kind of subtle compensation you make when you don't want to admit something hurts. He looked at the floor. The two others from Ryder's group were issued citations and released they hadn't directly participated, and the statements from other passengers confirmed it. Yes, he'd intervened. They gathered their things in the quick, head-down way of people trying to get out of a space before the space defines them further. The rear door folded open. Cold air poured in. Ryder stepped out into the snow without looking back. The door closed. The bus was quieter without him, in a way that wasn't just about noise. Caleb got Route 17 moving again at 11:21 p.m. He radioed dispatch, got clearance, updated his log with the incident code and timestamps, and pulled back onto the mountain road like a man resuming a task he'd set down briefly for reasons that now required no further discussion. The wipers beat their rhythm. The heater ran. The lights of the bus threw pale yellow cones through the falsing snow. Buddy talked for the first several minutes. Then Harold, from somewhere in the middle of the bus, said to nobody in particular, "Good driver." Was it. That was the whole thing. 3 or 4 passengers nodded without looking up. Jessie Harmon, in row 7, had her forehead against the window again. But she wasn't watching the dark this time. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing had slowed. Whatever the window was doing, for her the cold radiating through the glass, the vibration of the bus, the simple sensation of something solid to lean against it seemed to be doing enough. Caleb saw her in the mirror. He turned the heat up 1 more degree. He got home at 1:17 a.m. The house was a small, 2-bedroom rental on Creekside Drive, the lower end of Blackridge where the property shrank and the yards were functional rather than decorative. Caleb had rented it for 4 years. He kept it clean in the deliberate, slightly austere way of someone who'd lived for long stretches in spaces where disorder had consequences. Kitchen was organized. The gear in the entryway closet was arranged by use frequency. The only real clutter in the house existed in the exact radius of Maya's room, which he maintained as a sovereign territory. He was allowed to enter, but not govern. She was asleep. He checked, standing in her doorway for about 10 seconds, the way he did every night, not intrusive, just present. The habit of a man who understood at a cellular level that knowing the status of the people in your care is not paranoia, it's competence. She was on her side, one arm around the pillow, that had replaced the stuffed animal she'd retired 2 years ago with the seriousness of a small senator making a formal policy decision. Closed her door without a sound. In the kitchen, he drank a glass of water, standing at the sink, and looked out the small window above it into the snow-quiet backyard. The motion sensor light on the back porch was on, triggered by something a branch, probably, or the cat from next door, that occasionally crossed through like it was doing inspections. His left knee was aching. It did that in cold weather. Had done it since a certain night in a certain place that no longer appeared on operational maps because the operation had been classified and the location had been subsequently rebuilt by another government or for other purposes. The knee was a permanent receipt for something that had cost more than the physical damage, not that he thought about it that way. Exactly. More that the ache was there sometimes, and he acknowledged it the way you acknowledge a scar. It was information. It had no opinion. He'd been putting off the cortisone shot his doctor had mentioned for 3 months because the appointment required a weekday morning, and weekday mornings were Maya's school run, and he hadn't found a way to square the two that didn't. Compromise the one thing he refused to compromise. He rinsed the glass and set it in the drying rack. He sat at the kitchen table and pulled his phone out and looked at it. He'd had 4 messages since he left the transit depot. 2 from the transit authority supervisor, an automated incident notification, and a follow-up from the shift manager, asking him to call in the morning to confirm details for the formal report. 1 from DeLuca, brief and professional, noting that additional information about the camera footage would be requested through official transit channels by end of business the following day. And 1 from a number he didn't recognize. It had come in at 12:44 a.m. He opened it. "My name is Teresa Harmon. Jessie is my daughter. The officer gave me your operator number, and I looked up the company directory. It's late. I just wanted to say thank you. Jessie called me when she got home, and she told me what you did. She said you were the only one who did anything. I don't have better words than thank you. Just thank you." Caleb read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table and sat there for a while. Outside, the snow had slowed. Through the kitchen window, the backyard was white and still, and the motion light had gone off, leaving the dark to settle back over everything like a patience. He thought about Ryder Kane not with anger, not even with much interest, just with the mild attention you give something that needs to be understood before it can be properly filed away. He'd met Ryder Kane's type before, in different configurations. The specific flavor of young man who had discovered early that physical competence is a form of currency, and had spent the subsequent years spending it without ever asking what the exchange rate was for the things it bought. That wasn't tragedy. That was just unfinished business with the world. See, the one Caleb didn't try to answer in the kitchen at 1 a.m. because there was no useful answer at 1 a.m. was what the young man would do with the rest of it. The fact of what had happened on the bus. The fact that something he had believed to be a certainty had turned out not to be. Those moments had a way of either cracking things open or hardening them closed, and there was no reliable way to know which direction a person would go until they went there. He wasn't going to lose sleep over it. He had enough things to lose sleep over that were actually his. Call from his supervisor came at 8:47 the next morning, while Maya was eating cereal and complaining with remarkable focus about the fact that her social studies teacher had assigned a project on Montana's economic history, which she described as the single most boring subject in the documented history of human education. "It's literally just numbers and farms," she said. "I get it. There was wheat. There was a lot of wheat. There was copper," Caleb said. He was on the phone already, but it was still ringing. Whole economy shifted on copper mining in the 1880s. Actually pretty interesting, if you go past the textbook. She looked at him with the expression that 12-year-olds reserve for adults who have said something irredeemably unrelatable. "I'm just saying." His supervisor picked up. "Caleb, Dave Richter had run the Blackridge Transit Authority's Mountain Division for 11 years, and had the voice of a man who dealt with problems at scale, and had stopped being surprised by individual ones. You want to tell me what happened on 17 last night before I read the incident report? Caleb told him. Concise, same version he'd given DeLuca. Richter listened without interrupting, which was his habit when the information was actually new to him, as opposed to when he was listening to confirm what he already knew. When Caleb finished, there was a pause. Camera footage checks out. DeLuca's report says, you used Richter, clearly had something in front of him. He wrote down proportionate physical response in defense of self. That's what he's going with. That sounds right. It also says the primary passenger, the one in the jacket, went for you first. That on camera too? Should be. Another pause. Longer this time, Caleb Richter said. He stopped, adjusted, started again. I've got to do the paperwork. Transit authority policy. Any physical incident involving a driver goes to the safety board. That's automatic. You know that. I know. I'm also going to need you to talk to our legal consultant. Just a conversation, nothing formal. Fine. And Richter seemed to be choosing the next part carefully. I'm going to need you to come in this afternoon, if you can, because you're in trouble. You're not in trouble. But there's something else. Caleb looked at Maya, who was still eating cereal and had moved on from economic history to listing the various ways her school's lunchroom had recently failed her as an institution. She was doing it to the cereal bowl, not to him, which was its own kind of performance. What else? Caleb asked. The kid on the bus, the 16-year-old. He sent the video to a friend. Friend posted it. Richter paused. It's been up for about 9 hours. Caleb was quiet. How many views, he asked. Last I checked, somewhere around 40,000 and moving fast. Another pause. Yet, Sint-Puisend. There are 2 local news stations that have called our press line this morning. 1 regional. We also had someone from a sports media outlet, I don't know which one, asking about the man on the bus who put down a regional MMA fighter. Silence on the kitchen end of the line. In the background, faintly, and the pizza is always cold by the time it gets to the table, which defeats the entire purpose. Yeah, I need you to come in. I'll be there at noon, Caleb said. He hung up. Maya had stopped talking. She was looking at him with the sharp, undeceivable attention of a 12-year-old who has grown up reading her father's face and had learned that certain tones in his voice meant the day was going to be different than scheduled. What happened? She asked. Work thing. What kind of work thing? Kind I'll tell you about later. He picked up his coffee cup. Finish your cereal. I'll drive you. She studied him for another moment, really looked at him, the way she did sometimes, with those dark eyes that had come from her mother and that same slightly unsettling capacity her mother had for hisn't, for seeing past the thing you presented to the thing underneath it. Then she went back to her cereal. You're going to tell me everything later, she said. Like actually everything. Not the version where you skip the parts you think I can't handle. Eat. I'm eating and talking. I can multitask. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something moved between them, that specific and irreducible thing that exists between a parent and a child who have navigated enough together that they've built a private language for it. Something that didn't require words most of the time and only required words like eat your cereal. And I'll tell you later as a kind of shorthand. For I love you. I'm fine. Trust me. Give me a minute. She ate her cereal. He drank his coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the snow had stopped. The morning was pale and clear and cold in the specific crystalline way of high altitude. Mornings after storms. The world bleached and quiet and sharper than it usually was, each edge more defined. Caleb looked at his phone once more before he put it in his pocket. 40,000 views, Richter had said. Moving fast. He didn't search for the video. Didn't want to know what the comments said, or how the thumbnail looked, or which part of the footage someone had clipped to make it shareable. He had a working theory about what the internet did with moments it decided to care about. And the theory wasn't encouraging. He put the phone away. He helped Maya find her left glove, which had migrated to behind the couch cushion in defiance of all physical logic. He made sure her backpack had the project rubric she'd been complaining about. He locked the front door. He drove her to school in the old Subaru that needed a new front left wheel bearing and smelled faintly of pine from the air freshener Maya had picked out, and then immediately decided was too strong and had relocated to the back seat, where it continued to operate at full intensity in direct contradiction of her intentions. He drove. She talked. He listened. And somewhere on the other side of Blackridge, hotel room that the fight promoter was covering, until after the Missoula card, Ryder Kane was awake and staring at his phone at a video that had now crossed 60,000 views, 70. And that was cutting through the regional MMA community like cold water through thin ice. He was watching himself walk down that aisle, watching the moment 2, 3, 4 times when he had moved forward, and then the world had rearranged itself, and he had somehow ended up against the handrail with no clear memory of the transition between standing and not standing. Comments were not kind. Some were. Some were the kind of comments left by people who enjoyed watching confident people fall and wanted to express that enjoyment at length. Most of the rest were something in between, confused, curious, impressed not at Ryder's downfall, but at whatever the driver had done, which no one in the comment section quite had the vocabulary for. "Who is this guy?" one comment read with 1,700 likes. Ryder put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. In 11 hours, he was scheduled to appear at a promotional event for the Missoula card at a sports bar in downtown Blackridge, signing autographs, meeting the local press, doing the thing he'd built his life around doing. He lay on his back, on the hotel bed, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the expression on the bus driver's face after it was over, that particular stillness, that patience, that absence of any need to make the moment mean what Ryder had assumed moments like that were supposed to mean. He thought about it for a long time, and then his phone rang, and the screen said it was his promoter, and he knew from the fact that it was calling at 9 a.m. that the video had already traveled further than Blackridge. He let it ring 4 times before he picked up. "Yeah," he said. The voice on the other end was controlled but not happy. "Tell me what happened on that bus." Ryder stared at the ceiling. "Complicated," he said. "Make it uncomplicated," the voice said. "Because I'm looking at your name trending in an MMA subreddit, next to the phrase, 'got dropped by a bus driver,' and I need to know what I'm working with here." Ryder closed his eyes. Outside his hotel window, Blackridge was bright and cold and beginning to move through the first hours of a morning that had no interest in making things easier for anyone. "I made a mistake," Ryder said. It was the first true thing he'd said out loud since the previous night. He wasn't sure yet if saying it would matter, but it was true. "I made a mistake." The words sat in the hotel room after he said them, going anywhere, doing anything useful, just occupying space the way an admission does when it arrives too late to prevent the thing it's admitting to. On the other end of the line, his promoter, a man named Gil Ferris, who had spent 20 years in regional combat sports and had the patience of someone who had dealt with a very wide range of human stupidity professionally, was quiet for a moment. "Okay," Gil said finally. "Okay, walk me through it." Ryder did. He kept it honest, mostly. Not completely. There was a version of events where his approach to the girl was more ambiguous than it had been, and he presented that version without quite deciding to. A man adjusts a story in the telling, without fully acknowledging that he's adjusting it. But the core facts he gave straight, gone after the driver. The driver had put him on the floor. There was camera, footage, and witness statements, and a video currently traveling at speed across the internet. When he finished, Gil was quiet again. Longer this time. "The footage," Gil said. "The transit camera. See it yet?" "I have." Another pause. "Ryder, you went for him first. It's not ambiguous. He warned you. It's on the audio. He warned you twice, and you went for him anyway." "I know." Gil stopped, seemed to search for the right framing and come up short. "What exactly is this guy? Because what I'm watching doesn't look like a bus driver defending himself. It looks like somebody who's done that before. A lot." Ryder stared at the ceiling. "I don't know what he is," he said. "It's because that matters legally. Self-defense reads differently. If he defended himself," Ryder said. "Flat. I went for him. He defended himself. That's what happened." A silence that had a different texture than the previous ones. "Okay," Gil said. "Okay. I appreciate you saying that." He exhaled. "Here's where we are. The promotional event tonight, I'm pulling it. I'm not putting you in front of cameras and autograph tables 24 hours after this thing happened. The bar's already seen the video and they called us this morning anyway. So that's a mutual decision. Fine, the Missoula card. That's 6 weeks out. We have options. We can pull you from the card. We can keep you on the card and deal with the press. Or we can put out a statement and see how the wind blows for a week before we decide. My read is that you don't want to be on that card right now. Ryder said nothing. Ryder, I heard you. What do you want to do? He looked at his phone. He'd been checking the view count without meaning. To 70,000 had become 90, and somewhere around the time Gil had called, it had crossed 100,000 and was showing no sign of decelerating. In the regional MMA world, 100,000 views wasn't national news. But it was enough. It was more than enough. Let me think, Ryder said. I need an answer by... I said, let me think. Gil backed off. They ended the call without a resolution, which was its own kind of answer. The transit authorities' administrative offices occupy the second floor of a converted warehouse on the south end of Blackridge's commercial district, a practical, slightly grim space with fluorescent lighting and the specific smell of a place where paperwork has been accumulating for decades and has achieved a kind of atmospheric permanence. Caleb had been in the building dozens of times over 6 years. He knew the receptionist, knew which of the chairs in the waiting area had the broken armrest, knew that the coffee machine on the second floor produced something that was technically coffee in the same way that a rain puddle is technically a lake. He arrived at 11:52 and was shown into Richter's office at 12:04. Dave Richter was a broad man in his early 50s, with reading glasses perpetually on his forehead, and the desk of someone who managed logistics rather than people maps, schedules, whiteboard covered in route numbers and timestamps, one framed photo of a fishing trip propped against the monitor. He shook Caleb's hand and gestured at the chair across from his desk and didn't waste time on preliminary conversation. Legal's coming in at 2, he said. Before that, I need you to watch the footage with me. All right. Richter pulled it up on his monitor and turned the screen to face them both. He'd already cued it to the relevant section about 18 minutes into the run. When Ryder had first approached the partition, they watched it without talking. The camera angle was high and slightly wide, designed for coverage, not cinema, and it captured most of the cabin in a single frame with some fisheye distortion at the edges. The audio was cleaner than Caleb had expected. You could hear the road noise in the engine, and, over it, the conversation between Ryder and Caleb with enough clarity that specific words were distinguishable. Go sit down. Last chance. Walk it back. Go sit down. The motion which the camera caught, which the camera, like everyone else, had some difficulty fully processing. Caleb watched himself from above and to the right and noted, with the detached self-assessment of someone reviewing his own performance, that he'd been slightly slower coming out of the seat than he would have liked. The knee. He'd compensated for it, but the compensation was visible if you knew what to look for. He made a mental note and then set it aside because it wasn't the relevant issue. Richter paused the playback when the officers boarded. All right, he said. All right, Caleb said. Richter took his glasses off his forehead and set them on the desk. A gesture that meant he was shifting from the official of the conversation to the other portion. You want to tell me about the Navy? He said. Caleb looked at him without visible reaction. My file doesn't... Your file lists prior military service. Branch, Navy, discharge date, separation code. That's it. The separation code is the interesting part. Richter held his gaze. Pulled it this morning. I've been in transit admin for 11 years. I know what a standard honorable discharge code looks like, and I know what codes look like when someone's file has been subject to a records modification request from a government entity. Silence. I'm not asking you to tell me anything classified, Richter said. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking because 2 television stations and 1 sports media outlet have already called our press line this morning, and one of them, the sports one, has apparently done enough digging to know that the transit driver in the video has a military background, and they want to know what kind. Caleb was quiet for a moment. What did you tell them? That I'd refer all press inquiries to our public affairs coordinator. A pause. Who then told them nothing? Because that's what public affairs coordinators are for. Richter leaned back. But here's the thing, Caleb. If that footage keeps spreading, and it's going to keep spreading, I've already watched it cross the 100,000 mark this morning. At some point, someone's going to find out what's in your record. What used to be in your record before the modification. I'd rather know what I'm dealing with before they know what they're dealing with. Caleb looked at the paused image on Richter's monitor, himself from above, standing in the aisle of a bus. He was quiet for long enough that the quiet became its own kind of answer, and then he said, "I was a SEAL." Richter nodded once, slowly. "For how long?" 11 years. "Combat deployments?" "Yes." Richter absorbed this without apparent surprise, which meant he'd suspected it and had used the question as confirmation rather than genuine inquiry. Put his glasses back on his forehead. "Okay," he said. "That's what I thought. That's going to come out." "Going to come out," Richter said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who'd dealt with enough public situations to know how they moved. "Once it does, this story changes shape. Right now it's a local incident on a mountain bus that happened to get filmed and went semi-viral. Once your background comes out, it becomes something else. How do you want to handle it?" Caleb looked at the window. The Blackridge morning was doing its thing, pale sky, residual snow on the window ledge, a parking lot that needed resurfacing and hadn't gotten it yet. "I want to handle it the same way I've handled it for 6 years, he said. "I drive the route. I do the job. Whatever people decide to make of it is their decision." Richter studied him. "That's not going to be an option," he said gently. "I'm not saying that to be difficult. I'm saying it because the story is already moving without you, and if you don't have any presence in it at all, someone else gets to decide what it means." Caleb said nothing. "Talk to our legal consultant this afternoon," Richter said. "She's good. She'll help you think through the options." He paused. "Caleb, for what it's worth, the way you handled that bus last night, the way you reported it, the way you pulled over first, the warnings, you did everything right." "I just did the job," Caleb said. Richter looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's kind of the thing." The legal consultant's name was Patricia Osei. She was 40, precise, and had the particular quality of attention that makes you feel like what you're saying is being heard, and simultaneously filed in a system considerably more organized than your own. She met Caleb in a conference room at 2:15 and spent the first 20 minutes asking questions and the next 15 explaining where things stood. Criminal picture was clear. Ryder had initiated. Caleb had responded. The footage and witness statements aligned, and the district attorney's office had already reviewed DeLuca's report and reached a preliminary assessment that prosecution against Caleb was not supported by the evidence. Part was finished, or close enough to finished that it wasn't worth losing sleep over. The civil picture was less clear. Osei's read was that it was also unlikely to go anywhere. Given the documented evidence and the relative positions of the parties, one of whom had been in uniform, operating a transit vehicle, with a clear documented duty to ensure passenger safety. "Question I'd want you thinking about," Osei said, "is the publicity dimension. Because it has legal implications in and of itself, but because decisions you make in the next few weeks about how public or private you want to be will have practical effects." "I want to be private," Caleb said. "I understand. That may be difficult. I understand that too." He folded his hands on the conference table. "Is there anything I'm required to do? Legally or contractually?" "You're required to cooperate with the Transit Authority's internal investigation, which you've done. You're required to provide a statement to the DA's office if requested, which is a formality at this point. Beyond that, you're not required to speak to the press. You're not required to make a public statement. You're not required to do anything except continue to exist and let the process run. That's what I'll do." Osei looked at him the way people had been looking at him for the last 24 hours, with a particular quality of attention that had less to do with professional assessment than with simple human curiosity about a person who didn't quite fit the shape of their expectations. She didn't ask the question. He was used to people not asking the question while visibly wanting to. "One more thing," she said, pulling a single sheet from her folder. This was faxed to the Transit Authority this morning, from a law firm in Missoula. She slid it across the table. Caleb read it. It was a preliminary notice of intent, the law firm's letterhead, careful and expensive looking, advising the Transit Authority that their client, Ryder Kane, is considering civil action related to injuries sustained during an incident involving a transit authority driver.
No.
He set it back on the table. What injuries, he said. The wrist. Marcus Reed apparently saw a physician this morning. OC's voice was neutral. Fracture. A contusion. Yes. Caleb looked at the letter. Is this honestly? Given the footage? Given the witness statements? Given the fact that their own client initiated physical contact on a public transit vehicle, no. It's a reach. It may be a pressure move rather than an actual litigation intent. She paused. But it means someone on his side is trying to reframe what happened before it fully settles in the public record. Caleb nodded slowly. All right, he said. You're not concerned? He thought about it honestly. Not about the legal part, he said. The video crossed 250,000 views by Thursday evening. Caleb knew this because Maya told him. She had, despite his reasonably clear preference that she not go looking, gone looking the way 12-year-olds go looking when they have decided that information exists and that their right to have it supersedes whatever guidance they've been given about waiting. Yes, he'd intervened. She came into the living room where he was reading and sat on the other end of the couch and looked at him with the expression of someone who has learned something and is deciding how to present it. I watched the video, she said. He set his book down. I know, but it was already at school. 3 people showed me before I even... At school. Dad, it's at 250,000 views. It's not exactly hidden. She pulled one knee up to her chest. I watched it, and then I watched it again. He looked at her. Are you okay? He asked. She considered the question with the deliberateness she gave questions she actually intended to answer. She said, I think so. A pause. You look different in the video. Different how? I don't know how to explain it. She looked at the middle distance. Like you look like you, but also like someone else. Like someone I've seen pictures of, but not the actual person. She looked back at him. You know what I mean? He did know what she meant. Yes, he'd intervened. He also didn't quite know how to answer it, without going somewhere he hadn't planned to go with a 12-year-old on a Thursday evening. Pictures she'd seen were 3 of them a formal unit photo from his 3rd year in, a candid from a base in a country he didn't name when she asked. The one he kept in the nightstand drawer that he'd never explained to her because she'd never directly asked, and he'd never volunteered it. 3 photos of a man in his late 20s and early 30s who wore the same face. Caleb wore now, but wore it differently, occupying more space, leaning forward into the world rather than stepping back from it. He said, I know what you mean. Were you scared? On the bus? Not at all? He thought about it. When I was, he stopped. Started again at a slightly different angle. A long time ago, I learned something. Being scared and being calm aren't opposites. You can be both. Most of the time when things get difficult, being scared is just information. Tells you the situation is serious. What you do with it is the actual question. Looked at him. That's a very dad answer, she said. I am your dad. I know. It's just, she uncurled her leg and straightened up. Yet he'd intervened. I just want to understand it. People at school were talking about it like you're some kind of, I don't know, like you're this secret badass who's been hiding this whole time. He winced slightly at the language, and she noticed. Sorry, she said, not sounding entirely sorry. But that's what they're saying. I wasn't hiding anything, he said. I drove the bus. I drive the bus. That's what I do. You were a SEAL. She said it the way you say a thing when you've looked it up and you understand what it means, but you're still calibrating the distance between the abstract knowledge and the specific reality. Like an actual Navy SEAL. For a while. Dad, that's not a small thing. No, he said. It's not. He looked at her. It's also not the most important thing. It was something I did. It's not who I am. Who are you then? He looked at her steadily. Your dad, he said, who drives a bus and makes you eggs in the morning and forgot to pick up the dish soap on Tuesday, so we've been using shampoo to wash the plates. She looked at him for a long moment. Something cracked through, not a full smile. Something smaller and more complicated than a smile. The expression of a person absorbing something they know is true, even if it doesn't resolve all the questions. We've been washing dishes with shampoo, she said. It works fine, that is so... She shook her head. But I have more questions. I know. Not tonight? He looked at her. Not tonight, he said. She nodded. She pulled out... She pulled out her phone, the gesture of a 12-year-old returning to the primary medium of her existence, and then she stopped and looked at it, and then looked at him again. "Those people on the bus," she said. "The ones that were bothering the woman. Were you scared that one of them would—" "No," he said. "How can you know that fast?" "Because I looked at them," he said simply. She looked at him for another moment. Then she put her phone away, actually put it away, tucked it under her leg, and was quiet in a way that wasn't the quiet of someone ignoring a conversation, but the quiet of someone letting something settle. Outside, the night was clear and cold, and the Blackridge streetlights were casting their orange glow over the snow-covered lawns. And somewhere across town, the story was still moving, without either of them spreading into communities and comment sections and sports forums and chat threads, picking up velocity and interpretation and context and miscontext, becoming something larger and less specific than what it had actually been, which was a man on a bus deciding not to look away. Ryder Kane went to the promotional event anyway, the original event that had been cancelled. This was different. A smaller thing, a gym in the western district of Blackridge, the kind of place with rubber floors and motivational signage, and a heavy bag in the corner that had been repaired with duct tape at least twice. No, it belonged to a man named Coach Briggs, who had run youth boxing there for 12 years, and had called Ryder's management office not with a press request, but with a simple offer. "Come talk to the kids if you want somewhere to go that isn't your hotel room." Ryder had almost said no. He'd said yes instead, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. He sat in the folding chair that Briggs had set up in the center of the gym floor, and around him in a rough semicircle were 14 kids between the ages of 13 and 17, and they looked at him with the mixture of starstruck and skeptical that teenagers bring to everything. Some of them had watched the video. He could tell by the way they watched him, not with pure admiration, the way they might have watched him a week ago, but with something more complicated, more real. Briggs stood to the side with his arms folded. "Tell them about training," Briggs said. "Where you started." Ryder talked. He talked about starting at 11, in a gym not too different from this one. About losing his first 7 bouts. About the way losing teaches you things that winning never does, if you're paying attention. About the years of early mornings and the boredom. People never talked about the boredom of training. The long stretches of repetition that weren't cinematic or meaningful, just necessary. Kids listened. After a while, a 13-year-old in the second row, small kid, oversized hoodie, raised his hand. "Is it true you got beat up by a bus driver?" The room went tight. Ryder looked at the kid. "Yeah," he said. He didn't dress it up. Didn't add context or qualification or the lawyer-approved framing Gil had suggested. Just said it cleaned. "How?" "Because I was wrong," Ryder said. "Technically. About my technique or my footwork. I mean, I was wrong about the situation. I decided who he was before I knew anything about him. I decided he wasn't a threat because of how he looked and what he did for work." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. That kind of thinking, deciding you already know what something is before you've actually looked at it, that's not just a fighting mistake. That's a life mistake. The gym was quiet in this way that a space goes quiet when something is being actually heard rather than just listened to. Briggs looked at Ryder from the side wall with an expression that was unreadable. "Who he is?" another kid asked. "The driver?" "His name," Ryder said. "Are you going to do something? Like try to get back at him?" Ryder shook his head. "No." He said it without hesitation, which surprised him a little. "What would I get back at him for? He didn't do anything wrong. He beat you. He defended himself," Ryder said. "There's a difference." He paused. Pretty important one. Caleb had heard about the gym visit until 2 days later when DeLuca mentioned it in passing. DeLuca seemed to have appointed himself a kind of unofficial update service between the two parties, which Caleb hadn't asked for, but found he didn't object to either. "Heard your guy went to Briggs's place," DeLuca said. They were in the Transit Authority parking lot. DeLuca dropping off a copy of his finalized report, the two of them standing in cold air with their breath visible. Talked to the kids. Apparently told them he was wrong. Didn't try to spin it. Caleb considered this. "Good," he said. "I don't know, curious? Suspicious? About what? Whether it's real or whether it's image management." Caleb looked at the parking lot. A bus was pulling in from the morning run, not his route, One of the flatland loops and the driver, a woman named Carmen, waved at him through the windshield. He raised a hand back. Both things can be true, he said. He can be doing it partly for the image and partly mean it. That's how it usually starts. DeLuca looked at him. You sound like you're not angry at him, he said. Like it was a puzzle. I'm not. He came at you on your bus. He went after a girl on your bus. And he'll carry that, Caleb said. He's already carrying it. I watched his face when the officers took him off the bus. Wasn't someone who'd gotten away with something. That was someone who'd just found out something about himself he didn't know before. He shrugged slightly. What he does with it is his business. DeLuca shook his head slowly, disagreeing, just processing. You're a strange guy, Vance, he said. I drive a bus, Caleb said. The civil notice from Ryder's legal team was withdrawn on Friday morning. Explanation was given in the withdrawal letter, which was itself a form of explanation. OC called Caleb to relay the news, and he thanked her and asked if there was anything else that required his attention, and she said no, and the call lasted 4 minutes total. He drove his route that afternoon. The passengers were the same resort workers, tourists, the occasional local who needed the mountain connection. 2 of them recognized him from the video, and he could tell by the way they looked at him when they boarded. That moment of recognition where someone recalibrates the person in front of them against an image they've seen on a screen. Neither of them said anything. He was glad. The route went up through the switchbacks in the late afternoon light, which in November came at angles that made the snow glow orange, and the shadow lines of the pine trees stretch impossibly long across the white hillsides. It was the kind of light that reminded you that the mountain didn't care about the video, or the views, or the press inquiries, or the legal letters. It was just there. Yes, doing what it did, at whatever scale it operated on, which was a scale that made human drama feel appropriately sized. At mile marker 16, he passed the turnout without stopping. Of course he did. There was nothing there now, just gravel, and the compressed snow of where police cruisers had parked 2 nights ago, and the particular nothing that locations have after something has happened in them and moved on. Driving. The engine climbed. The heater ran. And Caleb Vance watched the road in the mirrors and thought, briefly, about the fact that his daughter had asked who he was, and he had told her the truest version of the answer he had. Her father, a man who drove a bus, a man who had made eggs that morning and would make them again tomorrow. All of it was true. All of it was insufficient. And somewhere in the gap between the truth and the insufficiency was the actual shape of him, not the seal, the bus driver. Not the man in the video. The photo intervened. Just a person who on the dashboard, enough to know the difference between what you could do and what you should do, and who had spent the last 6 years choosing, every day. The second thing. The resort lights came into view above the tree line, blinking on one by one in the early dark. He pulled into the upper terminal at 4:47 p.m. He opened the doors. Passengers filed out into the cold, and a new set filed in, and he logged the time and checked his mirrors and put the bus in gear. 17. Inbound. Evening run, same as it ever was. The inbound run reached the depot at 6:31 p.m., 4 minutes behind schedule because a snowplow had taken the eastbound lane on the lower switchback, and there was no negotiating with a snowplow. Caleb logged the delay, completed his post-shift walkthrough, checking the cabin for left items, verifying the fare register, and a cracked grab handle in row 4 that needed maintenance, and handed the keys to the night dispatcher with the same words he used every evening. Vehicle's clean. Handle in row 4 needs a look. Got it, the dispatcher said, already writing. That was the whole exchange. He drove home. Maya had made pasta overcooked jar sauce. Table set, and he ate it without comment because the gesture was the point. And she knew he knew that, and they had a comfortable working understanding about the difference between effort and result in the kitchen. After dinner, she did homework. He sat with coffee that went cold. The house was quiet, in the specific way that houses are quiet when 2 people who know each other well are in the same room not talking, which is a different kind of quiet than emptiness. He read the same page 3 times without retaining it. Set the book down. The video had crossed 400,000 views over the weekend. He knew this because Myas had told him Saturday morning, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news they weren't sure how to frame. He'd nodded and asked if she wanted eggs, and she'd said yes, and they hadn't discussed it further, which was its own kind of discussion. What he hadn't told her, what he hadn't told anyone, including Richter and OC, was that he'd received a message Friday evening through the Transit Authority's general contact form. Someone had gotten creative about reaching him since his personal contact information wasn't public. The message was 6 sentences. It was from a man named Warren Cole, who identified himself as a retired Master Chief Petty Officer, and who wrote that he had watched the video and recognized the movement pattern, and wanted Caleb to know that whatever he was doing with his life these days, he was doing it right. Caleb had read it twice, and then closed the browser and hadn't opened it again. He wasn't sure what to do with being recognized by someone who understood exactly what they were recognizing. It was a different thing than being recognized by civilians who saw something impressive without understanding its source. Yes, he'd intervened. Warren Cole had watched that 2-second sequence and read it the way you read a language you spent years learning, not the surface of it but the grammar underneath. Structure that only exists because someone built it through a very specific and very unpleasant educational process. Being seen that way felt more exposed than anything the video had done. He went to bed at 10 and lay there for a while, listening to the house settle in the cold, and eventually he slept. The Transit Authority Safety Board convened Monday at 9 a.m. 4 people across the conference table: Sandra Choi, the operations director, who ran the Mountain Division and had the contained, forward-leaning energy of someone who managed complexity for a living and was good at it. Next to her, the safety compliance officer, a man named Bertram, who wore a bow tie and took notes, a shorthand that appeared to be his own invention. Then Garza, the union rep, who had the weathered patience of a man who had sat in this exact chair configuration enough times to have stopped finding it remarkable. And at the end, the external consultant, a woman introduced as Dr. Sayers, whose background, per the brief bio OC had shared with Caleb beforehand, included 15 years in occupational risk assessment and a previous contract with the State Transportation Board. OCIC sat beside Caleb. Sandra Choi opened the proceedings with the formal framing: not punitive, disciplinary, assessment of policy compliance, determination of whether protocol modifications were indicated. She delivered it with the clean, practiced efficiency of someone who had opened many such proceedings and understood that the framing mattered because it set the temperature of everything that followed. "Do you understand the scope of today's review, Mr.?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Good." She opened her folder. "Start from the moment you made the decision to pull over. Walk us through your thinking." He did, same version he'd given DeLuca and Richter and OC Linear, precise, specific, where specificity mattered. He described his observation of the situation, developing in the rear of the bus, his assessment that verbal intervention was warranted, his decision to use the turnout rather than attempt to manage the situation while operating the vehicle, the sequence of PA warnings, and the physical confrontation. He used the same language he'd used before: minimum necessary force, threat neutralized, disengaged immediately. Bertram wrote. Garza watched. Dr. Sayers watched more closely. When he finished, Choi said, "Thank you. I have some specific questions." She turned a page. Transit Authority Driver Protocol, Section 7.4, Subsection C, states that in cases of passenger conflict, the preferred response sequence is verbal de-escalation, followed by dispatch notification, followed by law enforcement contact if verbal de-escalation fails. Does not include provision for physical intervention by the driver. What the protocol says, Caleb said. You deviated from it. I responded to an active physical threat. The protocol addresses conflict resolution, not physical assault in progress. Choi looked at him steadily. The protocol is intended to keep drivers out of physical confrontations. Physical confrontation came to me, Caleb said. I notified dispatch before the confrontation. I issued verbal warnings. When the passenger made physical contact, I responded. A beat. The protocol assumes the driver has a choice about whether to be physically involved. In this case, that choice had been removed. Bertram wrote something quickly. Garza shifted in his chair. Not restlessly, just the shift of a man registering that the exchange was somewhere worth noting. Mr. Vance, Dr. Sayers said. She had a measured, academically precise way to speak, suggested she chose words carefully because she'd learned what happened when she didn't. Your response to the physical threat, the specific techniques involved, these are not standard driver self-defense training. Transit Authority provides a 4-hour conflict de-escalation course. What you demonstrated on that footage is considerably beyond that. Yes, Kabzeb said. Can you explain the discrepancy? I had training before I joined Transit Authority. Military training, yes. Can you be more specific? OC put a hand on the table, not quite touching Caleb's arm, just present. Signal. He acknowledged it. I served in the Navy for 11 years, he said. My service included advanced combatives training as part of my operational role. What was your operational role? Dr. Sayers asked. That information is on file with the authority. The specifics beyond what's in the file aren't relevant to this review. Choi looked at him, then at the folder. Your service record, she said carefully, lists your MOS as Special Warfare Operator. She looked up. That sealed designation. Yes. The room was quiet for a moment in a way that had texture, the quiet of 4 people simultaneously recalibrating something. Garza leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, which was not a standard posture for a union rep during a safety board review. Why isn't that in your personnel file? Choi asked. It is in my personnel file, Caleb said. It's in the service branch and discharge date fields. The specifics of my operational role aren't required for a commercial driver's license application or a transit employment background check. Did you disclose it voluntarily during your hiring process? I wasn't asked. Would you have disclosed it if you had been asked? Pause. Brief, but there. If it had been relevant to the hiring decision, he said, yes. Choi absorbed this. Did you believe it was relevant? Caleb looked at her directly. I applied to drive a bus, he said. I had a clean background, a valid CDL, and 6 years of prior experience with a county transit system in Idaho. I don't believe my military specialization affects my ability to operate a vehicle safely or treat passengers with courtesy. A pause. On the night in question, it affected my ability to stop a physical assault without anyone getting seriously hurt. I'm comfortable with that outcome. Dr. Sayers made a note. Choi looked at hers. Garza said, "Can I ask something?" to the room generally, and Choi gestured for him to proceed. Mr. Vance, Garza said. He had a direct, unornamented way of speaking, not unfriendly, just economical. In your 6 years on this route, has anything like this happened before? I mean the escalation level, not the outcome. Not to this degree, but there have been incidents. There are always incidents on late-night mountain routes. Intoxicated passengers, disputes over stops, occasionally someone who gets physical about a fare. He paused. I've managed those within protocol. Did your training factor into how you manage them? Probably, Caleb said. I'm not sure you fully separate the training from the person. Garza nodded. That seemed to be the answer he was looking for, though he didn't say so. One more question. Garza folded his hands. Why this job? I mean, you spent 11 years doing something considerably more. He searched for a word. Considerable. Why a bus? The room was quiet. OC didn't put her hand on the table this time. Question wasn't legally complicated. It was just personal, and Garza knew it. And the slight look he gave Caleb suggested he was asking, not because the answer mattered to the review, but because he was a human being who was genuinely curious. Caleb looked at the table for a moment. I have a daughter, he said. She was 3 when I left the service. I wanted a job where I came home every day. He looked up. The whole answer. Nobody wrote anything. After a moment, Choi cleared her throat and moved them back into the formal portion. Review concluded at 11:40 a.m. OC walked with Caleb to the parking lot afterward. The morning had warmed slightly, still cold, but the aggressive below-zero edge of the previous week had backed off, and the sky was doing something almost blue, which in November in Blackridge was worth noticing. That went well, she said. Garza's question at the end wasn't on the agenda. She said, it wasn't. She pulled her coat closed. For what it's worth, I've been in a lot of these reviews. The moment Choi said Special Warfare Operator out loud, and you just said yes, and kept going, that was the moment the temperature changed. Because it impressed them. Because it told them you weren't performing anything. You were just answering questions. Caleb looked at his car. What's the likely outcome? He said. Policy clarification, probably. Update the driver protocol language to address active physical assault scenarios more explicitly, which honestly has been a gap for a while, and this gave them a reason to close it. Beyond that, she shook her head. You're not in trouble. You were never really in trouble. They needed to do the review because that's the process, and now the process is done. When can I go back to the route? She blinked. You're not on suspension. Richter put me on administrative availability while the review was pending. That ends today, she said. Technically, it ended when Choi closed the session. She looked at him with the expression she'd had in their first meeting, that specific, curious quality. You want to go back? I have a route, he said. She looked at him for a moment. I'll confirm with Richter, she said. You should have clearance by this afternoon. He was back on Route 17 by the 2:15 p.m. departure. Richter had confirmed it with a two-sentence email and a handshake when Caleb came through the depot, and Carmen, who'd taken the morning run in his absence, had left the vehicle clean and topped off and had taped a small note to the dashboard in her handwriting that said, "Welcome back." Vance, with a smiley face drawn beside it, which was not something Caleb would ever have expected from Carmen, and which he found, unreasonably, somewhat affecting, pulled the note off and put it in his jacket pocket. Drove the route. The afternoon passengers were the early shift workers heading back up for the second half of a split, a handful of resort guests with expensive luggage, two kids who looked like college students on a ski trip, and Harold, the maintenance worker from the night of the incident, who boarded at the Mountain View stop and nodded at Caleb when he came through the door, with the particular nod of a man who had witnessed something and had decided that no further words were necessary because the nodding said it. Caleb nodded back. That was the whole exchange. The story broke nationally on Wednesday. Not in the way Caleb had been bracing for, not a sensationalized version, not a tabloid framing. A long-form piece in a sports and culture publication written by a journalist who had apparently spent 5 days making calls and had talked to DeLuca, to Garza, to Coach Briggs, to two of the passengers on the original bus, to two people from Caleb's Navy yearsers whose names Caleb didn't recognize until he read the piece and placed them, the descriptions, men he'd served alongside, in a context, article described carefully, without specifics, respecting what was classified and building what it needed from what wasn't. He read the piece, sitting in his car in the depot parking lot after the evening run, on his phone, with the engine running for the heat. The headline was not what he'd expected. He'd expected something about the fighter and the bus driver. The headline instead said, "The man who chose the bus." Piece didn't sensationalize the combat. It barely described the incident on the bus beyond the public record, the warnings, the confrontation, the outcome. What it spent most of its words on was the space between 11 years of service and 6 years of a mountain route and a daughter and a dashboard photo, and the particular decision that Caleb had never thought of as a decision because to him it had been the only logical conclusion of everything he'd learned. He couldn't read it entirely objectively because it was about him, which meant it had the specific discomfort of hearing your own voice on a recording recognizable and slightly off, filtered through someone else's equipment. But it was honest. He hadn't spoken to the journalist. The journalist had noted this, a single paragraph near the end that said Caleb Vance had declined to comment and had done so without explanation, which the journalist described as consistent with everything else that had been described to him by the people who talked. His phone had been generating notifications since the piece went live at noon. He'd silenced it at noon and hadn't looked at them. He looked now. 47 text messages. He didn't read them. 3 voicemails, 2 numbers he didn't recognize, one from his sister in Oregon, who he talked to 3 or 4 times a year and whose voicemail he'd listened to later. 11 emails to his personal account, which very few people had, which meant several of them had gotten it from somewhere he hadn't intended. Put the phone in his pocket. He drove home. Maya was at the kitchen table when he came in, laptop open, and she looked up at him with an expression he recognized, the one that meant she had been waiting for him to come home specifically, just waiting for him to come home generally. I read it, she said. I figured. Why didn't you tell me about some of that stuff? He sat down across from her. He didn't take his jacket off first, which was a sign, and she noticed, which meant she was reading him the way she'd been reading him, since she was old enough to know that what he says no and what his body said were sometimes different documents. Which stuff? He said. The article talks about a training accident, she said. It says you were injured during a training exercise. She looked at him steadily. Is that what happened to your leg? He was quiet for a moment. A training exercise, he said. Then what? Another moment. It was an operation, he said. Overseas. Something went wrong in a way that things sometimes go wrong. He looked at her. I was with people I trusted. We were doing something that needed to be done. Afterwards, my leg didn't work the way it had before. He paused. That's most of the true answer. What's the rest? The rest is classified, he said. Genuinely. Not, he shook his head. I'm not being evasive. There are specific details I'm not legally able to tell you. Because they're dramatic. Because they're documented as classified. And that designation doesn't expire. She looked at him for a long time. Did people get hurt? She asked. Other people. The kitchen was quiet. Yes, he said. She absorbed this. He watched her. The way her eyes moved slightly. The way she pressed her lips together. The small adjustment of her posture that meant she was holding something she didn't know where to put yet. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. It was a long time ago, he said. I'm still sorry. She looked at the table and then back up. Any of that. Like I knew you were in the Navy and you were in combat and that stuff. But I didn't know. She stopped. The article makes it sound like you came back and just quietly decided to stop being that person. I didn't stop being that person, Caleb said. He thought about it. I figured out which parts of that person were the equipment and which parts were actually me. And I put down the equipment. What's the equipment? The rank, the mission structure, the identity of it. The way that world tells you who you are based on what you can do. He paused. Actual me, the person underneath all that he just wanted to be somewhere quiet and raise his kid and not have to calculate threat levels in a room full of strangers. You still do that, Maya said. Calculate threat levels. You were doing it on the bus. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. Some equipment you don't really put down. You just stop carrying it in front. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him across the kitchen table, the way she sometimes did, really looking. The full attention version of it. The version that had always reminded him of her mother, who had been a person of remarkable perceptiveness, and who had also once, a long time ago, yes, he'd intervened, looked at a 28-year-old Navy SEAL across a restaurant table and seen something that she decided was worth the complications that came with it. I think the article is good, Maya said finally. I think it says something true. I haven't decided what I think yet. I know. I think it's good anyway. She turned back to her laptop, then stopped. Looked back. Dad, yeah. The woman on the bus. Jesse, did you ever find out if she was okay? He had. DeLuca had given him a brief update the previous week, relayed through official channels. Jesse Harmon had provided her formal statement, was not pursuing any additional action, and had, according to the resort HR department, requested to transfer to an earlier shift so she could take a different route home. She's okay, he said. Maya nodded. Good, she said, and went back to her homework. Ryder Kane called the transit authorities' general line on Thursday morning. He was transferred twice before reaching Richter, who told him politely that he couldn't facilitate personal contact between Ryder and any transit authority employee, and that if he had legal matters to raise, he should direct them through counsel. Ryder said he didn't have legal matters to raise. Richter said he understood, but the policy still applied. Ryder said he understood. He hung up. He sat in the hotel room. He was still in the same hotel, the fight promoter no longer covering it, paying out of his own pocket, because he hadn't yet figured out where he was going next, and looked at his phone and thought about what he actually wanted. He wanted to say something to Caleb Vance. He wasn't sure what exactly. He turned it over enough times in the past week to know that he wasn't operating from anger anymore, which was progress. What he was operating from was harder to name. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Something more like the particular unsettlement that comes when you discover that the map you've been using doesn't match the territory, and you have to figure out whether to make a new map or just accept that you've been going the wrong direction. The article had done something to him. He'd read it 3 times. The part about the incident, that part he'd already processed to the point of diminishing returns. Part that kept stopping him was near the end, a quote from a woman named Carmen, who drove a parallel route and had known Caleb for 5 years. She'd said something that the journalist had put in, without apparent awareness of how hard it would land. She'd said, "Caleb is the kind of person who gets things done without needing you to know he got them done. The world could use more of that and less of the other kind." Ryder had put the phone face down after reading that. The other kind. He'd been for most of his adult life, very much the other kind. He called his mother that Thursday morning because he hadn't called her in 3 weeks, and because she was, despite everything, the person whose read on him he trusted us most, which was information he would never volunteer out loud. She picked up on the second ring. "Ryder," she said. Just his name. The specific maternal inflection that conveys approximately 37 pieces of information simultaneously. "Hey, Mom, I've been waiting for you to call." "I know." He looked at the ceiling. "Been figuring some things out." "I gathered that." A pause. "I watched the video. And I read the article. You want to tell me what happened? Or do you want to tell me what you're going to do about it?" He thought about it. "Both, maybe," he said. "Start with what you're going to do," she said. "You've always thought better forward than backward." Smiled, "A real one. Small, the kind that doesn't require an audience." "I want to talk to him," Ryder said. "Vance. I don't know what I'd say. He stopped. "I feel like I owe him something that I don't know how to pay through a legal process." His mother was quiet for a moment. "An apology isn't a transaction," she said. "Owe him something. You owe yourself something. There's a difference." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said finally. "Is the fighting finished?" she asked. "The career." A long pause. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. I don't think I can go back to it being what it was." He exhaled. "I met these kids at a gym last week. Troubled kids, mostly. Boys who needed somewhere to put all the energy they had that was going to go somewhere bad, if it didn't go somewhere good. And it was the first time in a week. I felt like I was doing something that made sense," he said. His mother was quiet. "Then maybe you have your answer," she said. The formal outcome from the safety board came in writing on Friday afternoon. A letter to Caleb from Sandra Choi. 2 pages. Formal in tone and clear in content. The review had concluded that Caleb had operated within the reasonable scope of his duty of care obligations to passengers. Protocol 7.4c would be reviewed and updated within the next quarter to include explicit language addressing driver response to active physical assault. Disciplinary action was indicated. The letter concluded with language noting that his conduct before, during, and after the incident reflected well on the professionalism of the Transit Authority's Mountain Division operators. Richter called 5 minutes after the letter hit Caleb's email. "You see it?" he said. "Just read it," Caleb said. "Good outcome." "Yes." "You back on the route this afternoon?" "I've been on the route since Tuesday, a beat." "Right," Richter said. "Of course you have." He paused. "Listen, Caleb. A couple of things. Press situation has mostly settled. The national piece I think it reframed the story in a way that doesn't require ongoing commentary from us or from you. And the sports media angle has moved on, because there's a card this weekend in Missoula that has new things to cover. I think we're past the acute phase of this." "Good." "The other thing." Richter seemed to be choosing the next part carefully. "I got a call from a woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh. She runs a training program at the state-level transit safety, de-escalation, conflict response. She's been trying to update the curriculum for about 3 years, and she's apparently been looking for someone with a specific combination of operational experience and civilian context to help develop the physical response component." A pause. "She saw the footage. She saw the board letter. She wants to talk to you." Caleb was quiet. "I'm a driver," he said. "I know. I told her that. She said she wasn't asking you to stop being a driver. She was asking if you'd be interested in a consulting conversation." Richter paused again. "Told her I'd pass it along. What you do with it is your business." Caleb looked out the window of the break room where he'd taken the call. The depot yard outside was gray and busy buses pulling in and out, maintenance workers moving between vehicles. the ordinary industrial motion of a place that existed to get people where they were going. Send me her contact information, he said. Already in your work email. All right, Caleb. Richter's voice shifted slightly less operational, more human. For what it's worth. The way you handled that whole week. The board, the press, all of it. I've been in this business a long time and I've seen people handle a lot of things a lot of ways. He stopped. You handled it right. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I just did the job, he said. Richter laughed a short, genuine one. He said, I know. That's what I mean. Called Dr. Marsh that evening after Maya was in bed. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Marsh was direct and specific. She'd done her homework, knew his background at a general level and was clear about what she was and wasn't asking. She wanted someone who could help translate operational physical response training into civilian transit contexts, not to turn drivers into fighters, to give them a conceptual framework for threat assessment and a few basic techniques that were proportionate to the situations they actually encountered, taught by someone who understood both the high end of the spectrum and the specific, mundane reality of a mountain bus route at 10 p.m. She offered him a 3-month consulting contract, part-time, structured around his existing schedule. He said he'd need to think about it. She said she understood and gave him a week. He thanked her and hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house and turned the offer over in his mind with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, not rushing toward the answer, not avoiding it, just giving it enough space to settle into its actual shape. He hadn't been looking for anything beyond the route. He hadn't been not looking for it either. He picked up his phone one more time and looked at the notification count, still high, still growing, the long tail of a story that had found its audience and would run until something else replaced it. Thought about Warren Cole's message, the retired Master Chief who'd recognized the movement pattern and written 6 sentences to a stranger through a transit company contact form. He thought about the journalist's headline, The Man Who Chose the Bus. He turned the phone over on the table. Outside, Blackridge was cold and dark, and the mountains were out there doing what they did, enormous and unhurried. Somewhere on the other side of town in a hotel room he'd been in for 2 weeks, a young man who had built his identity on his ability to walk into a room and be the most dangerous thing in it was sitting with the specific, difficult knowledge that identities built on that foundation have a weight-bearing problem they hold until they don't, and when they stop holding, there's nothing underneath to catch you. Caleb knew something about that. He'd been through his own version of it, quieter and slower, and what he'd found on the other side wasn't less than what he'd had before. It was different, more sustainable, built on things that didn't require witnesses. He stood up from the table. He checked the lock on the front door, checked the thermostat, poured the rest of the cold coffee down the drain. In the morning, he would drive Maya to school and listen to her describe the ongoing institutional failures of the school lunchroom. And then he would drive Route 17 up through the switchbacks in whatever weather November decided to provide. The mountain would be what it always was, and the heater would run, and he would watch the mirrors. Same as it ever was. That was still the right answer. Was just beginning to think it might not be the only one. Called Dr. Marsh back the following Wednesday and told her yes. She asked if he had conditions. He said 2. First, the training had to be practical, nothing theoretical that couldn't survive contact with an actual late-night bus route. Second, it had to work around his schedule, not replace it. He was a driver. That wasn't changing. She said both conditions were acceptable. He said he'd see her the following Monday at the State Transportation Training Center in Billings, which was 2 hours south, and meant a 5 a.m. departure, which was fine. They ended the call in under 4 minutes. He told Maya about it over breakfast the next morning while she was eating toast and reviewing what appeared to be a catastrophically underprepared vocabulary quiz. You're going to teach people? She said, without looking up. Consult. It's different. What's the difference? I'll still be driving the bus. She looked up from the quiz sheet. Dad, she said, with the specific patience of a 12-year-old explaining something obvious to an adult. That's not what I asked. He drank his coffee. Teaching implies I know the answers, he said. Consulting means I know some of the questions. She looked at him for a moment. That's a very dad answer again, she said. I'm aware. She went back to the vocabulary quiz, but she was almost smiling, and he caught it in his peripheral vision and noted it in the private ledger he kept of the small, unremarkable moments that constituted the actual substance of a life. The sentencing hearing for Ryder Kane was scheduled for the second week of December. The charges misdemeanor assault and disturbing the peace were not complicated. The DA's office had reviewed the transit footage and the witness statements and the physical evidence and had reached conclusions that aligned with every other party's conclusions. Ryder's attorney had been realistic from the start. There was no viable defense that would survive the footage, and trying to build one would only extend the process and increase costs without changing the destination. Ryder had entered a guilty plea in late November. The sentencing was a formality, procedurally. Interesting part was what happened around the edges of it. He arrived at the Blackridge Municipal Courthouse at 8:50 a.m., 10 minutes early, wearing a dark jacket and the expression of a man who had made a decision to stop managing how he appeared and was finding the experience both uncomfortable and, in some way he couldn't quite name, lighter. His attorney was already on the courthouse steps. Yes, he'd intervened. They went through morning sequence quickly. The attorney had spoken to the DA's office. The sentencing recommendation was community service and a fine jail time, a short probationary period, standard for the charge profile, prior record, and the demonstrated remorse that Ryder had, in fact, demonstrated the gym visit with the kids, the retracted civil complaint, the phone calls Gil had told Ryder he didn't have to make, but that Ryder had made anyway to the Transit Authority's Public Affairs Office, acknowledging what had happened on the bus without qualification. Attorney said the judge was likely to follow the recommendation. Ryder nodded. They went inside. Caleb was not in the courtroom. He had been asked, through official channels, whether he wanted to provide a victim impact statement. He had thought about it for 2 days and then declined, sending a brief written note through OC that said he was satisfied with the legal process and did not believe an additional statement was necessary or useful. OC had passed it along. DeLuca had told him, in one of their now occasional informal exchanges, that the DA's office had found this slightly unusual but had accepted it. Caleb drove the morning run on the day of the hearing, same as any other Wednesday. The 7:15 a.m. departure from the Mountain View stop, up through the switchbacks, yes, dropping resort workers and guests at their respective destinations, turning around at the upper terminal, coming back down. Standard run. 46 passengers total, spread across 3 round trips before noon. He didn't think about the courthouse. Or he thought about it the way you think about something that is happening in a parallel track and that you've decided is not your track, aware of it, not absent from it, just not driving it. What occupied him instead, on the morning runs through December, was something smaller and more immediate, the mountain light. November had been overcast, the kind of flat gray that sits on high elevations like a ceiling you can't raise. December had cracked open in the first week and turned brilliant, cold, precise, the sun hitting the snow slopes at angles that made everything look architectural, cut from something harder than weather. Kind of days that reminded you that the mountain had aesthetics that operated independently of human experiences, and that sometimes those aesthetics were genuinely extraordinary. He'd driven this route long enough to stop seeing it for stretches, the way familiarity makes things invisible. Lately, he'd been seeing it again. He wasn't sure what had shifted. Ryder walked out of the Blackridge Municipal Courthouse at 11:17 a.m. with a $200 fine, 40 hours of community service, 6-month probationary period that required no additional action beyond not repeating the behavior that had generated the charges in the first place. His attorney shook his hand on the steps. Clean record after probation, the attorney said. Fresh start. Ryder nodded. He wasn't thinking about the fresh start. He was thinking about the fact that Caleb hadn't shown up. In an aggrieved way, he hadn't expected Caleb to be there. And he understood abstractly why he wouldn't be, and it was the right call. But the absence of the man he'd been mentally preparing to face across a courtroom left him with something unresolved that the legal process had not, in fact, resolved. He stood on the courthouse steps in the December cold, and looked at the street and felt with some clarity that there was still a thing he needed to do that the sentencing hadn't done for him. Called Gil. "It's done," he said when Gil picked up. "Good outcome," Gil said. "Listen, I've been talking to a promoter in Denver. Not ready to talk about that yet." A pause. "Ryder," I said, "I'm not ready. Give me a month." Another pause longer. "A month," Gil said. Not happy. But he'd been in this business long enough to know when a fighter was telling him something real versus when they were stalling, and he could apparently tell the difference. "Call me before Christmas." "I will." He hung up. He stood on the steps for another minute, and then he made the decision he'd been building toward for 3 weeks, not a dramatic decision. Just the only logical next step for a man who had run out of reasons not to take it. Started walking. The Transit Authority depot was 11 blocks from the courthouse. He almost stopped twice. Once at the corner of Marsh and 4th, where he paused long enough that a woman walking her dog gave him a curious look. The look you give someone standing on a corner, who appears to be having an argument with themselves. He wasn't, quite. He was just checking his reasoning one more time, making sure it wasn't something that was going to feel like an ambush to the other person. Making sure what's going to say, when he got there, was what he actually meant, rather than a version of it constructed for an audience. The second time was at the depot entrance, where he stood at the gate for a moment with his hand not quite on the door. He went in. The woman at the front desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Caleb Vance," he said. "He drives here. I don't have an appointment. I'd like if he's available just 5 minutes." The woman looked at him with the neutral professional assessment of someone managing access to a workplace. "And your name?" "Ryder Kane." She absorbed this without visible reaction, which meant she recognized it and was deciding how to handle it. "Wait here," she said. She made a call, low-voiced, turned slightly away from him. He waited. The depot lobby had the institutional smell of every transit facility he'd ever been in, rubber and diesel, and the faint underlying note of an industrial coffee machine that had been running since before the current staff was born. The woman turned back. "He's finishing a log entry," she said. "He'll be out in a few minutes." "Thank you," Ryder said. He sat in one of the chairs against the wall and waited. Caleb came through the interior door at 11:42 a.m. He was in uniform, the worn elbow jacket, the transit ID clipped to his chest, work boots that needed resoling again. He walked with the slight limp that was always there, and that Ryder now understood was not the whole story of how the man moved, just the part the man chose to lead with. He stopped a few feet from Ryder. Ryder stood up. They looked at each other for a moment across the depot lobby, two men who had last shared space on a mountain bus in a blizzard 3 weeks ago under significantly different circumstances. "I heard the hearing was this morning," Caleb said. First words. "Yeah." Ryder cleared his throat. "Done." "Guilty plea. Community service, fine." Caleb nodded. "I wanted to come talk to you," Ryder said. "Not through a lawyer, not through some official." He stopped. "I just wanted to say it directly." "All right." Ryder looked at him. Caleb's expression was what it always was, patient, economical, giving nothing away that wasn't offered deliberately. "I was wrong," Ryder said. "Not just about you. About how I was on that bus. About how I've been—" He paused, choosing the right scope. "About a lot of things for a long time." He met Caleb's eyes. "I'm sorry. For what I did to the woman. For what I did to you. For all of it." Silence. Caleb looked at him for a moment. He said. Ryder blinked. "I've been watching," Caleb said. "The gym visit. The retracted complaint. The plea." He paused. "Those aren't the actions of someone who thinks they were right." "I didn't," Ryder said. He exhaled. "I didn't know how to say it out loud right away. Most people don't." Caleb's voice was level, not unkind. "Takes a while to get from knowing you were wrong to being able to say it in a room without a lawyer present." Ryder almost smiled. "Didn't quite. I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead. On the bus after." He looked at Caleb steadily. "You came back. You sat back down. You called dispatch. You were calm. Not relieved, not amped up, not—" He shook his head. "I've been in fights my whole life, and after a fight, even a good one, there's always something. Adrenaline, energy, something. You had nothing." Caleb waited. "How do you do that?" Ryder said. A pause. "You've been in enough fights," Caleb said. "You already know that most of what happens in a fight happens before the fight. The actual physical part is usually the shortest piece. He looked at Ryder. I'd been tracking the situation for 20 minutes before it became physical. By the time you moved, I'd already processed most of the adrenaline. Wasn't much left for afterward. Ryder was quiet. That's not something you get from training, Ryder said slowly. Caleb agreed. Not the kind of training you're thinking about. What kind, then? Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Question was genuine. Ryder could see that. And he thought Caleb could see that he could see it, which made the moment a different kind of conversation than the one Ryder had prepared for. Time, Caleb said, and failure, and deciding what the point of it is. He paused. You can get very good at fighting for reasons that don't hold up. It takes a while to figure out which reasons do. Ryder looked at the floor and then back up. I'm trying to figure that out, he said. I'm not there yet. Caleb said it simply, not patronizing, just accurate. The gym in the West District, Briggs's place. I heard you went. Those kids worth anything? Ryder thought about the 13-year-old in the oversized hoodie, the one who'd asked him straight out if it was true. He got beat up by a bus driver, he said. They are. Caleb nodded slowly. Then you've already figured out the most important part, he said. They stood there for another moment in the lobby of the Blackridge Transit Authority depot on a cold December morning. Two men who had arrived at this point by entirely different routes and who were not, any stretch, going to be friends, but who were standing in the same room without animosity, which, 3 weeks since it's been a prediction nobody would have taken. Ryder extended his hand. Caleb looked at it for a half second, not hesitating, just registering, and shook it. Firm, brief, the kind of handshake that doesn't need to make a point because the point has already been made. Take care of yourself, Caleb said. You too, Ryder said. He left. He drove back to the hotel, checked out for the first time in 3 weeks, and loaded his bags into his truck. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes with the engine running and the heater going, and it's no. He called Coach Briggs. It's Ryder, he said when Briggs picked up. Who it is, Briggs said. He wasn't warm, exactly, but he wasn't cold either. He was the kind of man who waited to see what someone was actually going to say before deciding how he felt about it. I want to come back, Ryder said, to the gym. Not as a visitor. I want to help. Regularly. He paused. I know I don't have anything obvious to offer those kids except...
He stopped.
Started again. I just got convicted of assault on a bus. I'm on probation. I'm not sure my professional career exists right now. I'm not exactly a role model. A silence on Briggs's end. Briggs said, You're not. Another pause. But a man who's been exactly where they're heading and knows it and is honest about it, that's more useful than a role model. Role models are people kids think they'll never be. What you are right now is something those kids can recognize. Ryder was quiet. Thursday afternoons, Briggs said. 4 to 6. Show up and we'll figure out what you're actually useful for. I'll be there, Ryder said. Don't thank me, Briggs said. Just show up. He hung up. Ryder put the truck in gear and pulled out of the hotel parking lot and drove west on Route 12 toward Missoula, where he had a storage unit with the rest of his things and a conversation with Gil that he was beginning to know the shape even if he hadn't fully written it yet. The mountains dropped away behind him as the road descended. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. The first session with Dr. Marsh's training program went badly in the way that first sessions of Ishima goes when the material is genuinely unfamiliar, not catastrophically. Just with the specific friction of a group of transit professionals encountering concepts they didn't have vocabulary for yet, and responding with the defensive skepticism that people deploy when something makes them feel out of their depth. Caleb had expected this. He'd structured the first session around a single question that he put on the whiteboard before anyone arrived, in plain capital letters. What do you already know? When the 12 transit drivers filed in and saw it, they stood around looking at it with varying degrees of wariness. He let them look. Sit down, he said. We're going to spend the first hour on that question. What the manual says. What you actually know from doing the job. A heavy-set driver in the front row 50s, 30 years of experience, the kind of person who has an opinion about everything, and is not shy about it, looked at Caleb with measured skepticism. With respect, the driver said, Why does a bus driver need combatives training? Caleb said. That's not what this is. The driver blinked. Then, what is it, decision-making under pressure? Caleb said. You already know more about that than you think. We're just going to make it explicit. The driver looked at him for a moment longer, then sat back with the air of someone who had decided to wait and see rather than commit to an opinion. It went better from there. Not smoothly, nothing about translating 11 years of operational experience to a curriculum for civilians was going to go smoothly, and Caleb hadn't expected it to. But it went honestly, which he'd learned a long time ago was more valuable than smooth. He drove back to Blackridge that evening through the dark on the highway. That connected Billings to the mountain corridor. 2 hours of mostly empty road with his headlights cutting through the cold. Rayout off because he liked the quiet. He thought about the day. He thought about the driver in the front row, who had stayed after the session ended and asked 3 specific questions that revealed, underneath the skepticism, genuine engagement with the material. He thought about a younger driver, late 20s, sharp, the kind of person who looked like she was already thinking 3 moves ahead, who had brought up a specific incident from her route 2 months ago and analyzed it with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been doing the analysis privately and had been waiting for a space where it was appropriate. Good minds, experienced people, nobody who needed to be taught to be capable, just people who needed a framework to hang what they already knew. Thought he could build something useful here. He didn't know yet if he was right, but he thought so. December moved the way. December moves in the mountains quickly, cold, the daylight compressed to something almost theoretical. Maya's school had its winter showcase, which she participated in with the calibrated enthusiasm of someone who had agreed to do a thing and was going to do it correctly, but was not going to pretend it was more meaningful than it was. He sat in the 3rd row of the school auditorium and watched her deliver 2 lines in a 1-act play about, apparently, a talking snowflake. And he clapped with genuine warmth, and she saw him clapping and made the face that meant she was refusing to smile in public, but was privately not displeased. He got the wheel bearing on the Subaru fixed in the 2nd week of December, which cost more than he'd set aside for it, and required a conversation with himself about the household budget that he conducted privately and resolved practically. He heard from DeLuca once more, a brief call in the middle of the month. DeLuca reported that Jesse Harmon had moved to a day shift at the resort and was doing well, according to the HR contact who'd passed the information along. He also reported almost as an aside, Marcus Reed had declined to pursue any further action, medical or legal, and had apparently left Blackridge entirely, returning to wherever he'd come from before joining Ryder's training circuit. Seems like most of the pieces landed somewhere reasonable, DeLuca said. Yeah, Caleb said. You doing all right? Driving the route. Working with Marsh's program on Mondays. It's fine. Pause. Just fine? Caleb thought about it honestly. Good, he said. It's actually good. DeLuca sounded satisfied with that. They ended the call. On the last Friday before Christmas, Caleb came home from the evening run to find Maya at the kitchen table with something that wasn't homework, a sheet of paper in front of her that she was not looking at, but was very aware of. The way you're aware of something you've placed somewhere on purpose and have been waiting for the right moment to present. He came in, hung up his jacket, unlaced his boots. What's that? He said, nodding at the paper. I made something, she said. He sat down across from her. She turned the paper around. It was a drawing pencil. Careful, the kind of careful that 12-year-olds produce when they've spent more time on something than they're planning to admit. It was a bus on a mountain road. Snow on the slopes on either side. A driver visible in the front window, just a shape, really, no face, but somehow clearly him in the posture. And beyond the windshield, the road going up into the mountains, which she had drawn with the pine trees at their December angles and the snow catching the light. She'd drawn it from the passenger's perspective, looking forward, past the driver, at what he was always looking at. He looked at it for a long moment. Maya, he said. It's not perfect, she said, quickly. The proportions on the bus are kind of off, and I couldn't figure out how to do the snow on the glass the way I wanted. It's not off, he said. The perspective is a little. She stopped. He looked at her across the table. The best drawing I've ever seen, he said. She rolled her eyes with the theatrical conviction of someone who was refusing to be moved by a thing that was moving them. That's literally not true, she said. Literally is, he said. She looked at him for a moment, that full attention look again, the one that came from her mother, and then she looked at the drawing, and then back at him, and something passed through her expression that was complicated, in the way that the emotions of 12-year-olds are complicated, carrying more weight than the moment should technically require, because 12 is an age at which everything that happens is also a rehearsal for something larger. Was scared, she said, when I watched the video. I didn't tell you that before. He waited. Not during it, she said. After. When I understood what could have, like, if the guy had been different or if something had gone. She stopped, straightened up. I know you're fine. I know it was fine. Was still scared. I know, he said, do you? She looked at him directly. Yes, he said. And I'm sorry that you felt that. Take that away if I could. You can't, she said. Matter of fact. But I also figured something out. After I was scared, after I read the article and talked to you. She looked at the drawing. You didn't do anything reckless. You didn't go looking for it. You just didn't look away. He was very still. That's different, she said, from being reckless. That's actually the opposite. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, Lint, in the house on Creekside Drive with the Christmas lights they'd put up the previous weekend in the window behind her, and he thought, not for the first time, with a clarity that was new, that whatever he'd gotten right in his life, whatever decision or series of decisions had led to this specific kitchen and this specific table and this specific 12-year-old looking at him with her mother's eyes and her own relentless, unsentimental perceptiveness, he'd gotten that part right. Perfectly. Nothing had been perfect. The marriage had ended. The leg hadn't healed. Clean. There were names he carried that he hadn't spoken out loud in years and wouldn't. He'd made decisions under pressure that he'd reviewed 1,000 times and found that some of them held up and some of them didn't, and that the ones that didn't were going to stay with him in the way that certain things stay, not punishing him, just present. Of that was gone. But none of it had taken this from him either. Thank you, he said, for the drawing. She nodded, slid it across the table toward him. For the dashboard, she said, picked it up carefully. Next to the small laminated photo of her with the fish. That's where it would go. Route 17 ran 6 days a week through the winter season. Caleb drove it the same way he always had both hands, mirrors, heat up 2 degrees above regulation. The dashboard photo in his peripheral vision on the left side, and now the drawing beside it, which had required a second piece of tape because the paper was larger than the photo and kept wanting to curl. The mountain did what it did. The passengers came and went. On a Tuesday morning in January, a new resort worker first week on the job, 19 years old, he's carrying a bag that was slightly too large for the overhead rack and wearing the expression of someone saying something that was either exciting or terrifying and hadn't decided which got on at the lower stop, and stood in the aisle uncertain about where to sit. Caleb caught it in the mirror. Any seat, he said. Doesn't matter which one. The kid looked up, surprised that the driver had spoken. Thanks, he said. He moved toward the middle of the bus. Caleb put the bus in gear. The route went up. The mountains were clear that morning, the kind of January clarity that comes after a week of storms, when the air has been scrubbed down to its actual elements, and what's left is so sharp it almost hurts to look at. The snow on the upper slopes was pristine in the early light, that particular blue-white that doesn't photograph correctly, and that you can only understand by being in front of it. Pines on the lower sections were heavy with pack that fell in chunks when the wind moved through, small avalanches that meant nothing and were beautiful. Anyway, he drove. He watched the mirrors. He thought Ryder Kane in a gym in Billings on Thursday afternoons, working with kids who had nowhere better to put their energy, doing a thing that would probably not make the news but would matter anyway in the invisible, unrecorded way that things matter when they're done without an audience. He thought about Dr. Marsh's training room and the driver in the front row who had stayed after to ask real questions. He thought about a girl with a gap in her teeth holding a fish like a trophy, and about a pencil drawing of a bus on a mountain road. No, and about 2 lines of tape on the edge of a dashboard. He thought about what he'd told Maya when she'd asked how he could not have been afraid. Being scared and being calm aren't opposites. The bus climbed. The engine worked. Mile marker 16 came and went, just a green sign on the side of the road, a number, nothing more. The turnout was empty. The gravel was snow-covered, unmarked, already returned to ordinary geography. Route 17, inbound. Morning run, same as it ever was. And exactly enough. A black belt proves what you're capable of. True strength is revealed by what you choose to do with it and what you choose not to.